A little bit about Brooklyn for Peace. We have been working in Brooklyn since 1984, which makes and marks our 40th anniversary. Our core mission is the prevention of war and the social, racial, environmental, and economic injustice which lead to war. We are primary an educational organization. However, we see active response to injustice as a vital component of our activities, which we hope will contribute to building a strong peace and justice movement, which is so needed at this present time.
Um, I'm really delighted to welcome Katrina vanden Heuvel, speaker for this evening's webinar. As Editorial Director and Publisher of The Nation, she is known to most of you. Between 1995 to 2019, Katrina was actually a magazine editor, as well as a frequent commentator on Democracy Now!, ABC, MSNBC, CNN. And I was looking through the list. I couldn't find Fox anywhere. I don't know. What a sad thing. She's written in multiple publications, including the New York Times, the Boston Globe, was a weekly columnist for the Washington Post, which is, I think, especially valuable because it was really often the lone voice amidst the unnatural consensus. She's the author of several books, including a volume she co-authored with her late husband, historian Stephen Cohen, Voices of Glasnost, interviews with Gorbachev's reformers. What I really want to recognize tonight is Katrina's heroic role in keeping alive an ongoing critique of U.S. relations with Russia and the sabotage of post-Cold War hopes. This topic of Ukraine, Russia, the U.S. Militarized involvement, this is not new, the enormously accelerated U.S. militarized involvement in the world, and also the changes in nuclear policy. These topics have not been popular for a long time, and not even among progressives, where there's been a lot of disagreements even within our own organization. And really, even before the Middle East catastrophe distracted people's attention, there really was a reluctance to get involved in all this. But Katrina has never lost focus on this. In her own writing and in her role as president of the American Committee for U.S.-Russian Accord, she has kept challenging the conventional wisdom and offering an alternative vision and a vehicle for people who have an alternative vision of what's happening in the world.
I appreciate what you said, very deeply appreciate the issue of Russia and the critique of Russia, and also alternatives. I've been at The Nation for much of my working life, first as an intern. The Nation turns 160 years old next July. We are the only publication now which has a peace correspondent. So I feel an affinity with Brooklyn Peace and the work you do. And I'm very grateful to be with not a room because it's a Zoominar, but with people who don't consider peace a subversive word, which I think has been part of the issue in this country. Tonight, too many wars are engulfing the world. And I think that's part of the work we have to do. It's not just single countries, but to understand the militarization of our thinking, our approach, and the dangers that poses. I want to talk briefly this evening about several intersecting threads which have brought us to this moment, and events which might have averted this crisis. And again, the alternatives, as Rusty spoke of, that were possible, that were on offer when the Cold War ended, though I think it has not fully ended. I think we live with the remnants, the vestigial elements of Cold War in our thinking, in our activities, in our approaches to issues like the military. I do think you mentioned the Quincy Institute. It's 5 years old. this year, and I think it's offered. And if you don't know it, it's important to check out because it's very much inside Washington, though it's moving to engage people around the country and the world. But what it does is it carves out a third way, not a bad third way, but a third way between the kind of neocon interventionism, which we've seen so self-destructive, and the neoliberal kind of intervention. And it offers, again, alternatives to the sort of suffocating consensus that is beginning to open a tiny bit, but which dominates DC and our politics. I wanted to speak for a word about Gorbachev. He's not remembered well today, but what he taught us, I think, is regarding true security. What's so tragic is that at the end of the first Cold War, or when the Soviet Union was abolished, that's a whole discussion in 1991, there were real alternatives. Gorbachev offered a set of lessons. Militarization does not make us safer. Security starts with cooperation, mutual cooperation, and a reminder that one of the best ways to safeguard our national security is to preserve and advance democratic institutions. I think of the years I worked. I first went to Moscow in 1978. I worked, and this would be heretical today, but I worked at a glasnost, kind of ending censorship newspaper, for 3 months covering the first Congress of People's Deputies election. I saw the censor cross the street every week and negotiate new openings, which in the end, the censorship really lifted. Then it was reimposed, of course. But you could see for a glimmer of a moment what was opening, what was possible. And what was really at the heart, so much of it was redefining security, which is an ongoing piece of work we need to do, which is not just Gorbachev, it's Olof Palme, it's people in CIPRI, it's people in this country like you who've thought about security in a different way. And the security reality is not idealism, nor is it isolationism, which is used quickly to stamp out alternatives. In my view, it's a kind of realism. Rusty may get upset with that word because it's often so associated with Henry Kissinger, but there are alternatives to that. I suggest, if you might, this is not a Thursday night reading, but one day pick up, I'll post it, I'll send it. It's about 6-7 pages, but it's Gorbachev's speech to a much maligned institution, the UN, the United Nations, which is a flawed but indispensable institution, as we've been seeing. But it's a speech he gave December 7th, 1988 to the UN. It's sometimes called the anti-Fulton speech because Winston Churchill was famous for Fulton, I think it was 47. Gorbachev astonished the global community when he announced drastic cuts in the Soviet military presence in Eastern Europe, a move that eventually opened up Eastern Europe. He also, though, he laid out the lineaments of a new world order, one based, he said, on the demilitarization of international relations, changing from an economy of armament to an economy of disarmament. He wasn't naive. He emerged from the Soviet system, but he was the most radical and committed arms reductionist, abolitionist ever to lead a nuclear country. You may remember Reykjavik, where for a brief moment there was possibility, though unlikely, of abolition. But he transformed ideas into real alternatives to begin to escape the Cold War. And he understood if we don't attempt what seems impossible, abolishing nuclear weapons, we will risk facing the unthinkable. And as important, at the end of the Cold War, the first Cold War, he and had others speak not just of NATO, not NATO expansion, but of a common European home stretching from, say, Lisbon to Vladivostok in the Far East, not a militarized zone. You've probably heard too much in these last couple of years about NATO expansion. Maybe not. Maybe you've been fortunately away from all of that talk. But what's happened in 1997, the nation did a special issue called Stop NATO Expansion. But today, or in the last couple of years, if you brought up why NATO expansion wasn't vital, why it was counterproductive, because it's essentially a lobbyist for arms sellers, you'd be called a Trumpite or a Trumpian, because Mr. Trump kept going on about how much it was costing him personally sometimes when in fact it was a much deeper discussion about militarizing what didn't need to be militarized. When NATO was first expanded in 97, the arms dealers were the major lobbyists in Washington, D.C. And what's also clear from archives, Rusty knows these, I mean, like the National Security Archives, books, letters, correspondence, is that a fundamental promise was broken to Gorbachev. And you can say, well, who cares? But that, in a way, led then to the US triumphalism. And the triumphalism prevailing at the end of the Cold War, in reality, no one won. Who won? If you look back at the money that is continuing to be spent, and you look back years, decades, think of all that could have been done to invest, to build a public health system, for example, we were talking about, and instead poured into weapons, which now appears we may not have enough of, based on. So it was in search of a purpose at the end of the Soviet Union, NATO. It was in search of a mission. Its antithetical part, Warsaw Pact, the Soviet military institution, had folded. So it was, you know, when you hear today that there's no reason for what we're seeing in the brutal World War I trench-like war, which Russia launched illegally, don't believe that, because the NATO expansion issue has been the driving escalatory factor behind the US-Russian Cold War, and it remains so. Today, Mr. Zelensky, who's admirable, he travels the world for his country. There are issues at home that he hasn't had an election, free speech, but what he's become, in a sense, is traveling for weapons, which is tragic. I mean, he's always needing weapons. But today, he said that he has a peace plan, a victory plan, but number one item is immediate accession to NATO. And that's already by European allies of this country. People have said that's not going to move. And you know, what's tragic is we're learning more and more from the records that one could have had a negotiated outcome a month or so after the Russian invasion. There was material that shows in Istanbul, Zelensky met with a Russian representative and a Georgian representative, but quickly Boris Johnson, that arbiter of integrity in the UK, flew over to Istanbul. And I think Victoria Nuland, who's back in the administration, in USAID and National Endowment for Democracy, worked hard to abort what might have been an outcome that wouldn't have left 600,000 Russian men from dying and some 150,000 Ukrainian men. Today, we learn, as the United States pushes Ukraine to lower the draft age, because it's 25, not 18, that Ukrainians and Russians are going into clubs, nightclubs, and conscripting men, just taking them. And the draft age, the limit in Ukraine is, I believe, 65, the high level. And the war weariness is enormous as they look out in a new winter, the mud. In fact, an independent polling agency in Kiev noted that some 57-58% of Ukrainians are now open to the idea of a negotiated outcome. What basis? Not conceding that the Donetsk, Donbass area is Russia's, but it be monitored, and that Ukraine be provided with securities, not NATO, but with sufficient security guarantees that Russia will not trespass. Now, this gets to a question which there's a fervid debate about, and I understand, but the idea of a domino theory in Eastern Europe, people believe in the Baltics, which have had a tormented history with the Soviet Union, believe that their security will be impaired, to say the least, if Russia's not, Russia's not defeated, but I mean, the idea of defeating Russia or even regime change in Russia seems so distant and so dangerous. But there are a few people in the Biden administration who see this war as a way to undertake a change of not just regime, but more than that. I think that, so we can discuss that. I will say that there were many distinguished people in the 90s who opposed NATO expansion, not just, Trumpites. George Kennan, you can disagree with, look him up, but George Kennan was one of the most distinguished diplomats vis-a-vis Russia. And he was in an interview, catch this, with Tom Friedman, and spoke of how the expanding NATO would be the most fateful era of American policy in the entire post-Cold War era. And he went on to say something which I've always believed, that at times of war, and I've seen this myself, it's very difficult to hear voices of dissent, to hear other voices, because war brings the most nationalistic, the xenophobic, the racist to the forefront. It squeezes out space for dissenting voices. I worked for some 10 years with feminists in Moscow, with other nonprofit groups, dissident journalists, semi-dissident journalists. And when war is on the horizon or conflict between countries, as we're seeing now, it becomes much more difficult to find a way forward. I wanted to talk a little bit about the nuclear, as Rusty was saying, the nuclear issue is just critical. The dismantling of a generation of arms control is what we're witnessing. It began fundamentally in 2002 when John Bolton, you may know that name, he never goes away, by the way. There are a whole set of sort of American establishment figures who never leave the building. They're there. They've decided they're going to stay. They may move around a little, but there's not much accountability. You might have been involved with the worst, deciding that we should go to war in Iraq, not a very wise decision, but you're not moving anywhere. So in 2002, John Bolton under George W. Bush was central to the rollback of the foundational arms control treaty, the anti-ballistic missile treaty. Since then, there's been a rollback of the fundamental scaffolding infrastructure of arms control to the point where there's one treaty left, which I believe is due to come up in February 2026, START 2. And if that isn't signed, the scaffolding comes down, and it's very, very difficult to put it back together. And what's also disturbing, and more attention needs to be paid to this, is that there's a modernization campaign underway, not only in the United States, but Russia, China, which is a code word for upgrading, for making more sophisticated, for putting more money in. And now we have AI, we have other forms. So it's really critical, it seems to me, that there be more attention to the nuclear issue in both the media and in the work you do. The New York Times the other day had the presence of mind it doesn't always have to retrieve history. And it reported, quote, "This appears to mark the first time that an American president has allowed the limited military responses on artillery missile bases and command centers inside the borders of a nuclear-armed country." That is when the United States gave permission to Ukraine to use US missiles, European missiles, to fire into Russia. It hit an early alert warning system, one of these weapons, first go-round. Early alert warning systems may be desiccated or not in good form, but they're needed like crazy. And now we see, as you know, the THAAD system with 100 US troops, I believe, traveling with them to Israel. So I want to say a few last things, but just the militarization of thought, of thinking, of security. If we continue to remain the policemen of the world, something I'm sure you've all talked about, with 800 bases ringing the world, we will not rebuild our country. We will not become the quote, I've always believed that we do well by building our best way at home toward that more perfect union, not continuing to build military equipment. Two things. We've now adopted military Keynesianism. We're making weapons, and President Biden and Kamala Harris both say this, that we're creating jobs at home by building weapons. That's tricky. You get it? I mean, that's been the case, but it's never been, I'm probably wrong, it's been stated very clearly now that this is part of our economic system. And I think we need to go back, and this is an ask. There is conversion. I'm sure some of you remember Seymour Melman. That was moving in important ways, and it syncs with the kind of Green Deal where more productive jobs, enterprises can be had if you take some of that military money. But until you create jobs for people, there's a reason there's a military base in every district or in every state. In fact, Northrop Grumman and some of those companies are building the infrastructure in some communities. So there has to be a fundamental delinking. The Reconstruction issue, we've never been great at Reconstruction. Look at Vietnam. I mean, there's going to be a kind of, I hate to think of it this way, but a looting of Iraq. The companies are, the Reconstruction czar until last week was Penny Pritzker. Not a bad person, but her idea of reconstruction of a country is to bring in all the big corporations, BlackRock, Blackstone, private equity. So I think of the people, like people in outside Siberia or in the east of Ukraine who've waged and lived through this horror. What are they going to get now? Freedom? Or are they going to get shock therapy of a kind that, you know, Jeffrey Sachs has redeemed himself from to some extent, because in the 90s in Russia, shock therapy led to greater depression than we faced in this country. I'm going to stop and say, I remember, as Rusty does, there were 1 million people in Central Park in June 1982 to fight for the freeze, which was a referendum on local ballots. Randy Forsberg, Randy Keeler, I don't know if you remember those names. There's a little bit of a campaign to begin that again, something simple. There are people around the country in certain city councils who have done resolutions. There's globally more around the ICANN issue and divestment from military companies. There's a cohort in the Congress, the Progressive Caucus, which includes Barbara Lee, people like that, who are worth following and supporting inside the system, and movements. The movement, climate change, and the nuclear issue might well be fused in certain areas because nuclear winter is a fundamental climate catastrophe. You know, the answer to war is not more war. I'm not a pacifist, but there are people who say, well, what's the alternative in Ukraine? I mean, I think unless you can resolve with security, fundamental security for Ukraine, you're going to see more dying, more pain, more illness, and a kind of escalatory dominance in Ukraine that I have to say Obama recognized. He knew that for Russia, in its area, it meant a lot more to Russia, the fate of Ukraine. But I want to just end, and I want to just read a quote, because he was he was our civil rights correspondent from 1961 to 67. And let me find it. So Martin Luther King Jr., a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. And I believe that. I believe that. And I think it also means that there's a fear of speaking out and a fear of alternatives that is at the bridge of war politics. But I will stop, and I'd much rather take your questions. And I thank you for inviting me.
The first question that was asked was when you mentioned a negotiated settlement between Ukraine and Russia. What do you see as the main basis for such a settlement? What more or less would it look like?
So I would suggest to people they go back and look at the 5 or 6 negotiation outlines that have been in place since 2022. As I said earlier, just a month after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, in Istanbul, there was a template. It often had to do with land, the issue of seizure of land, who that would belong to, sovereignty, but it also extended to language, it extended to religion, it extended to education, it extended to making sure that in the absence of having nuclear weapons, which were very obsolete, by the way, the Hungarian Budapest memo in '94, which is often cited, where I mentioned Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine disposed through US involvement of their weapons, nuclear weapons. They were, the cost of maintaining those weapons, the cost of refurbishing them was something Ukraine couldn't have done. But the main thing is that there have been 5 different efforts, at least, often overseen by Europe, not the United States, that could lead the way. And I think the war weariness, this serious war weariness on both sides, could sustain at this stage a negotiated outcome, which was not possible a year ago.